Good afternoon and welcome to the first subject-related session from Uni for Me. As you may or may not know, Uni for Me is a partnership of nearly 60 higher education organisations who have all put activities on the Uni for Me website on our site that you can access for free. And today we're having an introduction to anatomy and physiology with Dr Chrysanthi Fergani, or Chris, as she's sometimes known. Chris studied at the University of Thessaly in Greece initially, before doing a master's and then a PhD at the University of Liverpool. And then went on to further work as a postdoctoral fellow at both the University of Michigan and Harvard Medical School. So she's been all around the world. So it's an absolute pleasure to welcome her this afternoon.
Okay. Oh, thanks so much for that, Martin. So hi, everyone. As Martin said, we're going to give a little bit of an introduction to anatomy and physiology today. So sit tight and let's go through it because it's going to be fun. I will just give me 1 second and I will share my screen and we'll get started. Okay, so basically my name is Chrysanthi Fergani, Dr. Chrysanthi Fergani, and I am a physiologist. So basically what that means is that I'm interested in how living organisms function. How do they work? That is kind of what I've been focusing on for the past about 15 years of studying and working at various universities. So today we're going to talk about anatomy and physiology. But before we define it, I'd like you to basically, as you're sitting there in your seats, I want you to do various things. For example, I want you to take a deep breath. Okay, have a sip of water if you have it by, or a cup of tea. Okay, all of these are functions that are controlled by anatomy and physiology. So basically, anatomy can be defined as the study of the structure and the relationship between parts of the body. And what I mean by structure is what they look like. What are they made of? How are they placed in relation to each other? That's a really important thing to know. And physiology is basically the science of how those parts come together to function and keep an organism alive. So life is a result of a number of physiological systems that work together to function properly. So eating and drinking and cooling off and having sex and swimming, all of these are functions that are controlled by anatomy and physiology, and it can be explained with anatomy and physiology. So you can imagine how important that is. So first, what is an animal? Okay, humans are also animals, aren't they? So what is an animal? They have some common characteristics, and those are that animals can move, okay? They have locomotion, they can move. They are heterotrophs, which means that they need to feed on other organisms in order to survive. And moving around definitely helps with that, doesn't it? So basically, animals have evolved anatomical forms, anatomical parts of their body that help them move around and find food to eat. But those forms, those anatomical parts, are not the same across animals. Which you can see a picture of me here, I'm different than a bird, which is different than a whale, but all of those are animals. All of those animals move around in order to find food to eat. So let's see how a seal moves in space, okay, shall we? Let's have a look at a video. as you may have noticed, how does a seal move? Okay, a seal needs to be able to move on land, those big flippers. A seal also needs to be able to swim in the water very efficiently to escape all the predators, right? So those are the two things that a seal needs in order to move efficiently within her environment. What about a bat? Let's go and have a look at a bat. Quite different how a seal moves compared to a bat. However, both of those are animals, and both of those have anatomical parts that help them move around to find food. So basically, the point I want to make here is that the function, so how something works, how something in a living organism works, always reflects its form, so how it looks. So for example, if you see here in the pictures, you have the lower arm, the arm of a turtle, a human, a horse, a bird, a bat, and a seal. And as you can see, hopefully you can see that they kind of look so similar, don't they? So basically they have the same types of bones. So here is a humerus, what we call a humerus, a radius and an ulna, the carpals, the metacarpals, and the phalanges. And you can see that there's homologous, which means that there's similar bones, similar anatomical parts in the bat, in the bird, in the horse, in the human, and the turtle as well. However, remember that seal, how it was walking, had to walk in water and also swim efficiently. And that's why if we go to the seal, we see that its bones are rather wide and big and heavy in order to help it and support it do that. What about a bat? Bat needs to be light. Bat needs to fly around efficiently. It can't have heavy, big bones like a seal does. It has to have thin, very light bones, and that is exactly how the arm of a bat is. So they're homologous, which means they're similar structures, but yet they're different because they have adapted in order to serve the animal in its specific environment. A bat needs to fly, so its bones are lighter. A seal needs to efficiently move on land and efficiently swim in the water, and therefore its bone structure is a lot heavier and bigger and wider. So what does an organism need in order to stay alive? That's a pretty important aspect of physiology, right? What kind of things does an organism need in order to be able to survive and thrive in its environment? Well, first of all, think of yourselves when you're thinking about this. First of all, it needs to extract nutrients from the environment, okay? All living organisms need food and water, don't they? Once they're taking in the food and water, what happens? They create toxins and wastes, and therefore organisms have to find a way to excrete those toxins and that metabolic waste. What else? Well, organisms need to grow, right? We're not born this size, we become this size. So they need to build all their internal structures, and they need to grow, and they need to develop. What else? They need to sense their environment, don't they? The environment is constantly changing, and we have to adapt to it. That's what being alive is about. Therefore, they need to be able to sense their environment and respond to it in various ways, including by moving and finding food. What else do organisms need? Well, we just talked about the environment, how it constantly changes, and we have to change with it. But there's also a very important thing that living organisms need to do, and that is that they need to maintain constant conditions internally. What else? How does any species survive? It survives by reproducing and making more copies of that species. So then you also need a reproductive system. So basically, in order to survive and function, as we just about, organisms have evolved complex body systems, okay, to deal with these challenges. They have complex body systems that basically function and complete all of those functions that we've just talked about. Let's go and have a look at what I mean. So there's various different types of organisms around, isn't there? So for example, we have unicellular organisms. What does that mean? It means uni means one cell. So there's a whole organism that's just one cell. An example of such an organism is an amoeba. So an amoeba has actually the ability to do all of those functions that we just mentioned. It can take in and digest food. Look at those long arms that it has. It basically engulfs its food and digests it. It has the ability to excrete waste. Okay, if there's something that an amoeba doesn't need to keep inside its cell, then it can basically excrete it into the external environment. An amoeba can move. Even though it's one cell, it can move because it has these pseudopods, these projections that are like feet-like, and it just moves around. It can also reproduce. It can make copies of itself. Okay, so basically the way an amoeba one cell reproduces is with a process that we call binary fission. And basically what it does is it splits in halves and it makes two identical copies of itself. And therefore it reproduces. So if a unicellular organism is so efficient at being alive and they can basically do all those functions that we said are necessary for life, then why have multicellular organisms developed? Okay, why do we have animals that are huge? For example, look at this whale. There's a lot of cells in that whale, isn't there? Well, that's because there's certain advantages to having a bigger size. What are some of those advantages? If you're big, you can prey on other organisms. Okay, so you can eat more complex organisms and therefore gain a lot of nutrients and develop the living organism. What else? If you're big, you're probably able to resist forces of nature. Look at that whale. If a big wave comes towards it, it's probably not even going to care, is it? Nope. Its big size is protective. So what are some of the advantages, well, of multicellular organisms? Well, they have large size, and we just talked about what that does, but also it has specialized cells. So each of its cells has transformed itself or developed into a specific form, and that helps keep it alive. All those cells can do all those different functions that we just talked about. Some cells are for digesting food. Some cells are for metabolizing our organisms and other things. Some cells are for movement. Some cells are for thinking. Cells specialize within living organisms. So what are organisms made of? There's different stages of development that we can basically identify. So organisms are made up of the very smallest atoms and molecules, such as hydrogen and oxygen, okay? And when certain atoms bind together, they make molecules. And living organisms, for example, humans, are made of like 7 so many. Yep. But we're not going to go into that now because that is mostly covered in chemistry. So cells, basically, what are cells made of? They're made of a variety of molecules that come together and form a cell. What about tissues? Okay, tissues are groups of similar cells that come together, and what they do is they perform a common function. Yep, so a cell is one cell, and a tissue is many cells that come together and they function, and they come together to work towards a common function. What about organs? Okay, organs, for example, the stomach, consist of 2 or more tissues that are combined, and then they make an organ. What about organ systems? Organ systems are a collection of organs that come together to perform a particular task. For example, your digestive system, okay, which involves your stomach, your liver, your intestine, your esophagus, your mouth, right? All of those parts are part of your digestive system, and that contains lots of organs that come together. And then lastly, the organization of living organisms consists the actual organism itself, when many organ systems work together to perform functions of an independent organism. For example, a human is an organism, or a dog is an organism, or a seal, or a bat. Let's go and take a closer look at each one of these different levels of organization. First, we have the cell. Okay, now you probably know a lot about the cell already, but here I just want to say that there's so many different types of cells, right? Because in multicellular organisms, cells specialize. So they need to look a specific way in order to have a specific function. So we have cells that look like the one here on the left, which is an epithelial cell, and that has the function of secreting things, right? Yeah, and that's why it has this sort of shape. Or you can have other types of cells like neurons, like nerve cells, which are long. They can basically connect your spine to your toe, and that's like a meter-long neuron. That's a meter-long cell. There's so many different types of cells. What about tissues? As we said before, tissues are groups of specialized cells that come together to perform a function. For example, there's over 200 types of cells, but there it can be classified into 4 groups. Let's go and have a look at what those are. First of all, we have epithelial tissue. Now, the main function of epithelial tissue is to cover and secrete internal organs. To cover internal organs and secrete various fluids that are necessary for an organism to survive. We have connective tissue, and that tissue has a function. Its main function is to provide support. What about muscular tissues? I'm sure you know about that one. That one's involved in movement, okay? The one that we need to go around and find food. Yep, that one, pretty important. And lastly, we have the nervous tissue, which is basically used for control and communication. So that's kind of one way how your brain tells your toe to wiggle. Yep, through nervous tissue. So how do I know all this? How have I studied the tissue? How do I know how tissues are organized? Well, I know this because there's a science that's called histology, and histology is the study of tissues. So in order to actually study tissues, you need to be able to see them, and they're pretty small. Cells are kind of small, aren't they? So we need to use a microscope. We need to see them under a microscope in order to be able to observe them and see their anatomy, how they're formed, how they look, and then obviously correlate that with the physiology of how they work. So in order to see tissues, we need to preserve it. Okay, that's the first part. We need to put it in chemicals that kind of freeze cells in their current structure so that we can look at them under the microscope. Next thing is we need to slice the tissue. We need to slice the organ into very, very thin pieces, right? Yeah, very, very thin, so that we can look at a specific cell under the microscope. And tissue does not have color. So it's not this nice little pink that you see here. So I need to stain the tissue. I need to put some color in it in order to be able to see it. Pink is a nice color. Some other tissues are purple, some are blue. There's lots of colors, but the color helps me see it under the microscope. So let's go and have a look at specific tissues. First, we talked about the epithelial tissue, and that is based, and you can see a picture of it here. So it's a group of cells, and basically what these cells do, their main function is to create barriers between different compartments of the body. So they line your gut, they line your intestine, your heart. All of the organs are basically lined with epithelial tissue. for protection. And also they frequently have secretory functions. So they secrete different things that are necessary for all those functions that we talked about that are necessary for a living organism. For example, they could secrete digestive juice, digestive enzymes. What about muscular tissue? Yep. Muscular tissue contracts and generates forces and movement. That's how you can move your arms, your legs. That's how you walk. That's how you move around in order to find what to do what? Find food. Yep, that's pretty important. So we have three types of muscle tissue, actually. First one is skeletal muscle. That is basically responsible for voluntary movements of the body, like moving around your arm. We have cardiac muscle, which is basically the muscle that makes up your heart. Yep, your heart is a big muscle. It's made up of cardiac muscle, and that's how the heart contracts and pushes blood out of the valves and away towards the rest of the body. We also have smooth muscle, which provides motility to the internal organs, such as the digestive tract. Lots of organs need movement, and muscle layers and muscle tissue helps exactly with that. Next, we have connective tissue. Connective tissue basically provides structure and support. Now, it's quite varied, and connective tissue is basically fat tissue, so adipose tissue. Bones are made of connective tissue. Tendons are made of connective tissue. And blood. Yep, blood cells. Red blood cells are part of connective tissue. Last but not least, my favorite, nervous tissue. Nervous tissue basically conveys and processes information. That is how your brain basically communicates with the rest of your body. That's how your spine communicates with your toe, through nerves. Some of them are pretty long. Now, after tissues, what happens? When we combine two or more types of tissues, those form an organ. For example, what? Your intestine, or your heart, or your stomach. That's an organ. So, but the type of tissues that an organ has definitely defines its functions, okay? So usually, most organs contain all four types of tissues. So let's go and have a look at the gut. Okay, so the gut, the inner part has what? Epithelial tissue, because it needs to secrete things, okay? It needs to secrete different enzymes and digest your food. Yep. We also have a lot of smooth muscle layers in your intestine. You need muscle, you need movement in your intestine. Why? To pass things along from one end to the other. Yep, that's what your muscle tissue in your gut does. What else? We have nerve cells. Yeah, did you know that your gut has nerve cells? Absolutely. And for example, that's how your brain can communicate with your stomach, and how your brain can communicate with your gut, with those nerve cells. Also blood vessels for sure. Yeah. So most organs contain all four types of tissues. What comes next? Organ systems. Okay, so organs are grouped together into organ systems. So certain organs work together and they help a particular function of the organism. For example, here you can see the organs of the respiratory system and of the cardiovascular system. So let's have a look at the respiratory system. You have the nasal passage. Yep. You have the trachea, which connects the nasal passage to your lungs, which basically take in the oxygen and then carry it into the bloodstream so that it goes to the rest of your body. So that's an organ system, the respiratory system. What about the cardiovascular system? That basically consists of your heart, which pumps out blood towards the rest of your body, and it does so through veins and arteries, through the blood vessels. That's the cardiovascular system. Living organisms have a lot more systems. That's for another day. So now let's go and have a look at some anatomy, shall we? Okay. Why do we need anatomy? We need anatomy, and I'm going to throw a lot of terms at you, a lot of difficult terms that you have to remember, and they're kind of confusing. But why do we need them? We need them because, for example, it's kind of like a verbal map. It's kind of like a new method of communication. So, for example, say that I'm eating a club sandwich, and I accidentally, because I'm really hungry, I swallow the toothpick. Yeah. And it gets stuck somewhere inside me as I'm swallowing. How is the doctor going to describe the surgeon where that toothpick is stuck so that she can go in, open up, and remove the toothpick? There needs to be some sort of common language that we have in order to describe exactly the position of certain things in such a precision so that a surgeon can go in and find that exact spot. And the way we do that is we use anatomical terms. So let's go and have a look at the major ones. So here is the anatomical position. The anatomical position is basically the body is upright, it is facing forward, and the arms are at the side and the palms look forward. Whenever you see a human body in that position, that is the anatomical position. Now, imagine if you were to slice a person into planes. Don't imagine it too much, just a little bit. So we have three different planes. The first one is the sagittal or mid-sagittal. And basically it divides the head, the body, and the body into equal parts, right and left. Yeah, you can see it here, right and left parts. The coronal or frontal plane divides everything in the body vertically into front and back. The transverse plane is the horizontal division of the body into what? Top and bottom. So we have sagittal, coronal, and transverse. Those are the three planes, and they divide the body into equal parts. How else can we, what other anatomical terms can we use to describe things? We can use the axial and appendicular parts. The axial skeleton, what is it? It's everything that is in line with the center of the body. So that is the head, the neck, and the trunk. And you can see it highlighted in red in the skeleton that's on the far right. What about the appendicular skeleton? Those are everything else, the arms and the legs. Next, we have anterior and posterior. Anterior is everything in front, at the front of the body. Posterior or dorsal is everything that's at the back of the body. So basically your eyes are anterior and your butt is posterior. But you can also say that your breastbone is anterior or to the front of your spine. Okay, so we use these anatomical terms in order to describe an anatomical part in relation to another. So my breastbone is anterior or in front of my spine. And my heart is posterior or behind the breastbone. What's next? Next is superior or inferior. So superior or else cranial is towards the top or towards the head. Inferior or caudal is towards the bottom, so away from the head. What is an example? The jaw is superior to the lungs, above the lungs, because it's above them towards the head, while the pelvis is inferior to the stomach. Why? Because it's below it. My pelvis is below my stomach, and therefore I say it's inferior to my stomach. We use these terms to compare anatomical parts with each other and their position. What about lateral and medial? So lateral structures are further away from the midline. If you imagine a middle line across the body. Lateral are things that are further away from the midline, and medial are things or structures or anatomical parts that are towards the midline. So basically, my arms are lateral to my heart, and my heart is medial to my arms. Next, we have proximal or distal. So proximal is towards or closer to the trunk compared to something else, to the main body, and distal is further away from the trunk or away from the body. What's an example? For example, my knee is proximal to my ankle because it's closer to the main body, closer to the trunk. My knee is closer to the trunk than my ankle. Whereas my wrist is distal to my elbow because my wrist is further away from the main body. Yep. So how do we use all these terms? Where will the surgeon operate if I have a toothpick that's stuck right here, as you can see on the skeleton? Well, what she's going to do is she's going to describe where it is in order for the surgeon to go in and remove the toothpick. And what she's going to say is that it's along the midline. It is posterior to the heart, behind the heart, anterior to the spine, in front of the spine, so between the heart and the spine. It's inferior to the neck, below the neck, and it's superior to the stomach, above the stomach. And that's how the surgeon's going to know where to operate and help me and potentially save my life. And that's all I have today. Thank you so much for listening.
There we go. Sorry. Thank you, Chris. That was really good. It's one of the perils of online work is remembering to unmute yourself. So I now understand why my head is superior to my stomach, which is a question that's long since worried me. Just a few questions. Nerves, what's the longest nerve in the body?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it's the one that kind of ties your spine to your toe, and it's about 1 meter long. I think so. Yeah, 1 meter. It's quite long, isn't it?
I was just really interested in that. A lot of the people who are going to be watching this, obviously during the pandemic, they've missed out quite a bit on the curriculum. Some may have been able to catch up online, some may not have been. But should they be worried about when they go to university? Is that going to put them at a disadvantage when they enter their courses?
Yeah. You know, Martin, we definitely make an effort to explain everything from the beginning. So every concept that you learn in university, we consider it that it's new. So we definitely make an effort to describe everything from the beginning. In addition, there's a lot of resources, both online and in libraries, that students can access and basically gain all the information, everything that they need in order to do well and thrive in a university environment is available to them. And finally, there's definitely support from tutors. Every student has a personal tutor who they can refer to and get advice from, even when it comes to things that they don't understand.
Right. So if they're worried about anything, there's always someone to go to talk about it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Everybody has their own personal tutor that they can get advice and help from at any time.
And again, I suppose, you know, within school, a lot of young people, they know about biology, but what other related subjects could they do at university which maybe cover this kind of area if they're interested in it?
What kind of subjects could they do?
Yeah.
Well, biology is such a huge discipline, isn't it? It's very diverse. There's so many different modules. They will study physiology, they will study anatomy, they will study genetics, they will study behavior, they will study health and disease, all of those things. And therefore, the skill set that students will acquire with a biological degree are so diverse and can be used in several fields. Not only in a lab setting, not only in the health sector. The skills that students get from biology can be applied to several different fields.
Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon, Chris. It's been a pleasure listening to you speak. Yeah, Uni for Me will return with another session next week.
Awesome. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.